Hey everyone, in this screencast I'm going to talk a little bit about the Cascade. CSS of course stands for Cascading Style Sheets, so we're going to review a little bit about what the Cascade part of that means. So with CSS it's possible to have rules that conflict. So you might create a style for H1s, but then maybe later in your CSS you have another style that also applies to H1, so that could be an example of a conflict. The Cascade basically gives us a set of guidelines for what happens when those conflicts occur. So there are sort of two groups that we're going to go through. One is order and the other is something called specificity. So the first thing in terms of order, the basic idea is that the rules that are closest to the element that it applies will win when there's a conflict. For example, let me add a couple of things in here for the M tag as an example. So we can see in my document here, all about potatoes, there's a paragraph. In this paragraph, we have a word contained inside the M or emphasis tag. So I'm going to add a style rule here. So my selector is the M tag, just a straightforward single selector. So for all M tags, I'm saying make the color green. So I'm going to save, come over here. I'm not using the live preview, by the way, with brackets, so I have to refresh every time I save. And we can see that my text is now green. So let's say that I forget that I've created that, and I now, maybe later in my CSS, I create another style rule where I say for all content within the M tag, make the color red. So this is an example of a conflict. I have two different rules applying to the same content, applying to the same selector. And I've used either different CSS properties or the same property with a different value. So this is an example of a conflict, and we can see when I refresh that the one that wins is the red color, and that is because it shows up later in my document. Or the other way to think of it, is that it is because it's later within my CSS, it's effectively closer to the content that it's applying to. So it's literally closer to the thing that it's applying to. So the closer it is, the more likely it is to win when there's a conflict. Similarly, remember that we have three ways to apply CSS. We have external, embedded, and inline. It's possible that I could have an inline style here where I'm going to say, let's do blue. So I've now created a third conflict. I have an inline style applying to that M tag, so to the content contained inside the M tag, and I'm telling it to use the same color CSS property, but with a different value. So this is saying make it blue, this is saying make it red, this is saying make it green. In this case, the inline style is actually going to win. And again, the way to think about this is this style is closest to the content, literally closest. So this is the one that's going to win. If I remove this, it then looks at my embedded CSS. There are two things in there. The one later in the document is always going to win. If I had an external CSS file coming in, the embedded CSS would override external. So again, the closer we are to the content with the style, the more likely it is to win. So inline style conflicts will override embedded conflicts, which will override external CSS conflicts. Another thing to think about in terms of order here is actually I will leave this here for now, is inheritance. So we've only talked about this a little bit, but with HTML, we have a structure here where we basically have like a parent-child structure. So everything, all of my content is contained inside the body tag, nested within the body tag. So a child of the body tag, we have the H1 tag. On the same level as H1, we then have paragraph. Nested inside the paragraph, we have an M tag. Also nested inside the paragraph, we have a strong tag. So that's the idea of inheritance or descendants or parent-child. So we need to keep that in mind with our CSS, because we might have a situation where, for example, I'm going to say make, so first of all, for all the content within the body tag, I've said make the font use the Arial font, or make all the text use the Arial font. I'm going to add another style rule here that says, but for H1s, use Courier. So this is technically another example of a conflict, because without that style rule, by generally saying everything within body uses Arial, what's happening is the H1 tag, for example, is inheriting the styles of its parent. Its parent in this case is the body tag. I've applied some styles to the body tag, so they go filter down to all of its children. So everything nested under the body tag is going to inherit the styles I've given the body tag. But we can add a style here specifically for the H1 tag, where we say font family Courier, use a different font for H1. See what happens. We can see when I refresh, the H1 tag now has the Courier font. So that is technically a conflict, because the H1 tag automatically inherits whatever styles its parent has been given. Its parent was the body tag. It was given the Arial font family. So it inherits that, and we're also saying on top of that, specifically for H1s, give it a different style. So in this case, again, the order is important here. The H1 appears after the body tag or closer to the content that it's applying, so that's what wins in this conflict. So that's order. The second area is called specificity. So this gets a little tricky. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to add in a few styles. So let's say for my strong tag, for my strong content, I want it to show up as pink. So I go over here, shows up as pink. That's great. That's what I was expecting. But I could create a contextual selector, if you remember those, that says, let's see. So basically, these two are conflicts. This rule right here says for all content within a strong tag, make the color pink. This selector says for any content inside of a strong tag that is nested inside of a paragraph, make that blue. So both of those technically apply to this strong tag right here. The first one says any strong tag. The second one says only a strong tag within a paragraph. So again, this is an example of a conflict because both of those style rules apply to the same thing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put this one first, because what we said before is that technically the order will affect what wins, meaning what's closest to the content it's applying to will win, which should mean that this would win. So the strong tag will show as pink. Let's go over here, see what happens. It doesn't show as pink, it shows as blue. And that is because of this other thing called specificity. So specificity is basically a guideline that gives a weight, literally a weighted value to each type of selector. So it gets a little complicated here. I'm going to add in some comments here so I can type out what this means. An individual selector has a weighted value of 1. A class has a weighted value of 10. An ID has a weighted value of 100. And then I'll get into some more specifics after that. So let's just start with the first one. So a basic selector has a value of 1. So what that means is when I look at this line right here that I have highlighted, I have one element in my selector. So that means this style rule here has a value of 1. The one above it, however, it's a contextual selector, so there's actually more than one element in the selector. It has context, so it's saying for any content in the strong tag that is nested inside of a paragraph, so each of those is just a basic element, a basic selector, but because there are 2 of them, the weighted value of this entire style rule here is now 2, because we take the individual selector, which equals 1, and we add it to the other individual selector, which gives us 2. So therefore, in terms of this conflict, the order actually doesn't have an impact because the specificity guidelines say that this, regardless of where it is within the order, the specificity value says that this rule is going to win because it has a higher specificity value. So let me add a couple more things here. Oh, well, actually, let's do this. So let's say for all of my list items, I want them to be purple. Okay, that works. All my list items are purple. But I'm also going to add a class, and whenever that class is applied, the content for that is going to be green. So I've created a class name, or I've created a class, and I've also added that class, I've given it a context. I've said when this class is tied to a list item, make whatever text is contained inside of that green. So to apply it, I would go down here, and I am just sort of going to randomly, with my second list item, give it a class. So I use a class attribute. The value I give it is the name that I gave my class. Again, I don't put the dot in there. The dot is only used within the CSS. So now I'm saying this list item has a class applied to it. In my CSS, I'm saying for any list item that has a class name applied to it called odd, make its text green. So again, what we have here is another example of a conflict. This rule says every list item should have purple text. So that should theoretically apply to all 3 of these. This says for any list item with that class, make the color green. So what's going to win here? So my number 1 and number 3 are purple because those don't have the class, that odd class. The second one is green. And again, even though it's not later in the order, that specificity guideline comes into play here because classes have a weight of 10. So in this situation, the weight of this style rule here, there's only one element in the selector, so that has a value of 1. Whereas this rule here has the li, which is a single element, has a value of 1, but it also has this class name. Classes have a value of 10, so technically the specificity value of this line right here is 11, which obviously is greater than 1, which is why this rule wins. You can also, of course, do the same thing with IDs. Let me do a quick one right here. So in this rule, I'm saying the font size for all paragraph text should be, well, let me just make it 120. Let's see what that looks like. So my paragraph text, which is just those 2 lines, is a little bit bigger. And then I can also say, define an ID. I'm going to call this one intro. So I'm going to say wherever this ID is used, make the font size 150%. So again, there's a conflict because I've already given all paragraph text a font size, but now I'm saying, but for this specific instance, and I need to make sure to not have a space there because the context here without the space says, for a paragraph that has an ID, that's the hashtag, called intro, so that matches this. If there was a space, that would mean, that would basically be saying for a paragraph that has something else nested inside of it with that ID, then apply this rule, but I'm saying the paragraph itself has the ID. So in this case, the specificity value for this rule is 1 because there's only one single element. Every single element has a value of 1, so you add them together if there's more than 1. There's only 1 in this case. With this rule, I have the paragraph, which is a single element, value of 1, but I also have an ID. IDs always have a value of 100. So the specificity value for this line right here is 100 plus 1, or 101, which of course beats the value of 1 with the line below it. So when I go over here, this paragraph that has the ID is going to have the larger font size. Obviously, this can get pretty complicated. The main takeaway right now is CSS has a set of guidelines for what to do when there are conflicts with style rules. Sometimes it's just literally the order, where things show in the order. So if the specificity value is the same, what's going to win is the thing that shows later in the document, or the thing that is closest to the element that it's applying. The other thing is specificity. Individual selectors have a value of 1. If you have a contextual selector, you're going to add all of those together. Classes have 10, IDs have 100. And the last thing I want to show you here is a little keyword we can use. So we have essentially 3 conflicts. So we have, for all strong tags, make them pink, but then we're saying, both of these are saying for a strong tag within a paragraph, and they have different values. So we have 3 conflicts. We need to figure out which one is going to win. First thing we do is we figure out the specificity value. These are both going to win over this one, because this has a specificity value of 1. These both have a specificity value of 2. Between these two, the one that's going to win is the one that shows later in the document. There's another thing we can do, which is use this keyword called important. When we use it exactly like this. We put exclamation point important, and we put it after the value of our CSS property that we're giving the importance to. So this, when you use that keyword, you're basically adding an extra 10,000 specificity points, which usually means that this is going to win regardless of where it is in the order, and regardless of what the other conflicts are in their specificity values. So in this case, oh, I guess it was already blue. But in this case, it stays blue, my strong tag here, even though it has the same specificity value as the line after it, and even though this one theoretically should win because it shows later or is closest to the content it's applying to, but because we use this important keyword, it adds more specificity points, which makes this line right here win in terms of that conflict. So again, the Cascade is basically a set of guidelines that help us understand what happens when there's a conflict with our style rules. The order of our CSS rules matter. Things that show later in the document will override things that show earlier in the document. So the closer you get to the content you're applying to, the more likely it is that the style rule is going to win or apply. And beyond that, depending on the type of selector you're using, if it's an individual single element or if it's a contextual selector, they have different specificity values, so that also has a factor in how those conflicts resolve. Main thing to remember, individual selectors have a value of 1, classes have a value of 10, IDs have a value of 100, and you add all of them together based on your contextual selector, and then that figures out, or that determines what wins when there's a conflict. So again, this can get pretty confusing. I'm going to review this again with you and have some specific examples so that you can understand how to add up those specificity values. But for now, this is the basic overview. And again, the Cascade, it's a set of guidelines that help us figure out how to resolve style conflicts. And it's important because what we need to understand why one style is applying over another, and then we can either adjust the selector, the contextual selector, we can move it later in the document, or whatever we need to do to make the styles apply that we want to. So that's the Cascade and specificity. As always, let me know if you have questions.